The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Nick Cortina. I'm excited to bring you another Exago support lab today. As you folks probably already know, I just want to make sure that my voice and screen are coming through all right. So if you could just type a Y or a yes in the questions pane, just let me know that you can hear everything I'm saying, see everything on my screen all right, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, perfect. And it looks like we are all set here. So once again, my name is Nick Cortina. We've got another great Exago support lab today, and we are going to be talking about custom interactivity and doing so using HTML and action events on reports. So we're going to go a little bit farther off the reservation today in terms of things you might normally expect to see in standard Exago report output. Now, with that in mind, I do just want to be very upfront that we're going to be seeing pretty much all code today. It's going to be nice and simple. I've really sort of, lessened the complexity of what we're doing just so that way we can focus on the features and the components of what we're able to do using some of the customization here. But we are going to be looking at a little bit of HTML. There's going to be a little bit of C# server-side code and a little bit of JavaScript on the client side. So if any of that stuff sounds like it's not really for you or, that's not really what you're interested in seeing, just be aware that that's really going to be the bulk of the content that we're looking at here today. So with the caveat out of the way, what are we actually looking at? Well, we're going to take a quick look at some custom report design where we're actually going to use HTML directly in cell content on the report designer. With that in mind, there's one caveat I do want to mention right up front that this is really primarily intended to be used with the interactive HTML output in the report viewer. So this isn't something that we're going to be looking to leverage for, say, our PDF or Excel exports. This is something that we want users to be interacting with on their screen on the report output. The other key components here are primarily action events. And so via those action events, we're going to see a little bit of server-side code by way of C#. We're also going to see some client-side code in JavaScript, and we're going to see a little bit of some interesting things that we can do using the JavaScript working with that HTML to actually scrape some values from a report and potentially do something else with those values where that something else can really be whatever you think makes the most sense with the values in your data set. So I think some of this stuff will make a little bit more sense if we start to just actually look at it. It's easier to show rather than tell. So I'm going to jump right over to Exago here. And let's actually execute this report so we can see what this looks like. And then we'll dig in a little bit behind the scenes and see exactly what's going on to make all this happen. So on my screen here, we can see that I've created a simple product inventory report. So this is actually kind of a recreation of another example that we've used with action events previously that you folks might be familiar with. In this case, we're doing something just a little bit different. So we're showing one line for each given product name that we've got here in our data set. We can see that we've got some quick information about units in stock and the units on order here. We've got a reorder level, so this is just simulating a restocking or an inventory report. And to the left side of our product names here, we've got these checkboxes that we can select. And we can pick any number of these that we'd like. And we've actually got this button at the top here that says restock. Now, when we select this button, these values will actually get scraped from the client side here and passed back to the server side C# code, where we can then pass those values along to either an external API, maybe back to our host application, or do something else, maybe even push them into a database table if we want to get a little creative. So in terms of how we're actually setting this up, let's first take a look at the report design so we can see what we have to do first here in Exago on the front end, and then we'll take a look at some of the back-end components that are coming into play here as well. So opening my report designer, we can see that I've just got a group footer, and if I expand my sections here, this is just a group footer on our product name, so we're going to show one row here for each product. And we'll start by taking a look at cell A4, and this is where those checkboxes are going to come into play. I'm going to open up our formula editor here, and we'll see that in this cell, I'm actually inputting HTML directly here. And so we can see that right here, I'm creating this input type checkbox, and that's what's actually creating that little checkbox that we can see on the screen. Now, another thing we're doing here is we're using this name attribute, and this is actually really important for the program code that we're going to see in just a second. But just keep in mind that we're assigning this name attribute of product restock selection. This is what's actually going to allow us to use JavaScript to find those values on the page and figure out which values have actually been selected. Now, the other important thing here to keep in mind is that of those checkboxes, we need to be able to easily determine what the specific value of each checked checkbox is. In order to do so, we're going to use the value attribute here. Now, this is where things actually got a little bit tricky in terms of setting up this example, because when we push in this value attribute, if we've got a product name that actually has spaces in the name, so I'm going to jump back to my output here for just a second, but even just taking one of these first examples, say Boston crab meat, if we see these spaces that appear here in that product name, when we push that in as the value attribute for the HTML, unless we properly quote those values, the value attribute will actually only be set to the first section of that string value, and everything after the first space that's encountered is going to get pushed off and actually pushed in as an additional attribute, which isn't really what we're looking to do here. That would be kind of erroneous. So with that in mind, jumping back to the designer here, what I actually did was I used single quotes to start constructing the HTML. As you may or may not be familiar with, in Exago's formula editor, we can use the single or double quotes when we're creating string values. So in this case, I specifically decided to use my single quotes here. And the reason why is what I can then do is concatenate that. And I have a nested concatenate here. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to put double quotes around each product name. And so by putting those double quotes around each product name first, I can then take that quoted product name and push that in as the actual value for the value attribute of the checkbox in the HTML. We can see then after that, what I'm doing is completing that HTML tag. And afterwards, I'm concatenating the product name again. And what that's actually doing is setting the product name to be both the value attribute by way of the concatenation here with the quotes, as well as the actual value that's going to be displayed next to that checkbox when the page is actually rendered. Now, outside of those checkboxes, we also saw the units in stock and on order. And while this isn't an integral part of the example, it is just a nice little thing to look at here. So just in terms of showing that we've got our units in stock concatenated with a slash and then the units on order. And our reorder level is just a data field here. Now, the final piece is that actual button that we saw, and that's being displayed in the top right. So if I show the formula editor here, we can see that this is again just straight HTML. We're creating a button. We've assigned an ID, we specified the type to be button, and then I've just got this restock text, and that's what's actually being displayed on the button in the output there as well. Now, when we actually select that button, so I'm jumping back to the output here, and I've got these couple values selected. In my case, when I click that restock button, what we're actually going to see is I've just got a simple text file on my machine here that's taking those values that we scraped when we selected that button and outputting them to a text file here. Now again, we could do something like write these back to a database table, call the host application and pass these values back or something to that effect. But in this case, I chose to keep the example simple, just that way everybody can follow along and see exactly what we're doing. So how did I actually scrape those values when we select that button? What's actually happening in terms of the Exago code behind the scenes there? If I navigate over to my admin console, this is where we've got a couple action events that are actually working to get those values for us. So we've got two events here. And this first one, get checked boxes, is actually the event that's assigned on that report. If we take a look at the designer of this report, we've got that button again in cell C1. And on my linked action events here, if I select that for that cell, we'll see that get checked boxes is the action event that's assigned on that button. Now, because I've got get checkboxes assigned and that event type is click, that means when I click that cell's contents, this action event's going to fire. So the really cool part is because I pushed an HTML button into that cell, I get the HTML button effect of seeing something be pressed when I actually click the cell. And at the same time, I'm getting the Exago action of firing this click action event. So we're really creating kind of this, key user experience component of having a button that's going to go launch some external code. And the beauty of this next component is that external code can really do anything we want. So to show you exactly what I mean by that, if I jump into the custom code here, we can see that all we're actually doing with this first event, this get checked boxes, is using some C# code. And we can see that the string action string here, and then the last two lines. What this is doing is taking this JavaScript that we've created as a C# string and pushing it into the session and assigning it to be used as a JavaScript action. So the way this is actually going to work is when this report begins to run, this JavaScript code will be loaded up by the C# code. And then when the appropriate action is taken, in this case, a click is registered on that cell, we'll fire the JavaScript code in the client side. So let's take another look at that report output. We can see here I've left a debugger statement in, and that's so we can actually see this during the interaction. So what I'm going to do is navigate back to checkboxes, and we can maybe even click a couple more of these if we'd like. And now what we're going to do is open up, I've got my dev tools here open on my other screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to click that button again. That's actually going to hit the debugger in our dev tools here. So I'm going to full screen this for a moment, but you can actually see that everything that we included in that C# string for our JavaScript, that's what's actually loaded into the client here. And that's what's going to be going and actually scraping those associated values. So you can see here that what we're doing is we've got this function scrape checks. And what we're going to do is we're first going to grab all the elements by their name. And as you recall, we assign that name attribute in the checkboxes. And that's why that product restock selection was so important, because we use this JavaScript function to make sure, hey, let's go get all those specific checkbox elements that we included on the report designer. From there, we create this empty array checked names. And what this is going to be populated with is each one of the checked named nodes that has actually been selected. And we'll see here down in this for loop, we're simply going to go through the length of the array. And if that, the specific node that we happen to be on in each iteration is checked, we're going to push that into the checked names array. Once we complete looking through all of the checkboxes, we'll finally get to the end of the for loop, and then we're going to do a server callback. So what we can do here is throw a little debugger here on line 20. And if we actually let the script resume, we'll see here that our checked names is going to contain 6 values, and those are actually all of the values that we had selected on the report just prior. So at this point, we've got all those values, and we want to actually pass them back to an additional method that we'd like to use on the server side. And that's why here you'll see that we're actually going to convert the checked names array to JSON because it's a little bit easier to pass the information back and forth if we first convert it. Now, the other thing that we might be thinking is, well, hang on a second, this pass restock values, we haven't talked about that method quite yet. And the interesting thing that we can do here is we can actually create additional action events to be used as callback methods. And that's actually what we've done in this case. So I'm going to move my debugger over for a moment, and we'll go back to our admin console. And we can see I've got this other action event called pass restock values. That's that callback method that we specified in the client-side script that get checkboxes loads. So once we get to that point in the client-side script where we call back to the server, we're looking for this specific action event, and we're actually passing back in that collection of values as JSON. You'll also notice that we don't specify an event type or a global event type for the pass restock values event. And because it's being used as a callback method, we don't need assigned event types. Exago knows that this event is just going to live here until it's called by some external callback method, and that's absolutely okay. The other nice part here is this event won't show up in any of the linked action event dropdowns because there's no associated event type or global event type. So if we take a look at this code, this is really all C#. And again, this is all going to happen on the server side. So at this point, we're first getting that collection of values back. And you can see that because it's that first argument we're passing back, I'm first just going to convert that to a string. And then I'm going to use the Newtonsoft DLL to deserialize that into a string array. We'll call that our parsed products. Then in my example, as we saw before, I'm simply just going to go through and for each of those parsed products, I'm going to write those to a text file on my local machine. We can see that specified here. But really at this point, once we've got the code, once we've got those values back on the server side here, we can really do anything we want with those values. As I've mentioned previously, we could push those to a database table, maybe to an external API or to the host application. Another possibility that we were considering before was pushing those back to a database table that another Exago report is hooked up to. So you could maybe schedule that report to go off to someone on a recurring basis. And maybe as part of your workflow, every so often you're executing that first report, specifying a number of values and passing those back, and they'll be populated in that secondary report that's set to be scheduled. So there's lots of different possibilities and things that we could do here. Again, really depends on your use case and what you'd like to do with those values post clicking that restock button or whatever that button means in the context of your application. The final piece here is we just return a null value, and that basically is just our way of in Exago of continuing our normal operation and not doing anything different here. So now that we see what this looks like, if we come back over and we bring this window back, we can let the script resume. And at this point, if we actually come back to that text file once again, we'll see the updated values have been pushed in. And so that's going to do it for today's example. Again, wanted to show something a little bit different, maybe a use case that you haven't really seen before, something where we're actually using direct HTML in the report output because we thought that seemed kind of interesting and different. If there's any questions, we'll be sure to stick around for a few minutes to address those. One thing I also did just want to mention is our next lab. The date is currently TBD, but what we're going to be doing is a continuation of the Train the Trainer mini-series. This time we're going to be looking at express views. In addition, there will be a survey that comes out after the lab, so if there's any other topics or things you're interested in seeing, definitely let us know. And with that, happy reporting.